So, it's wonderful to see everyone. And for this class, before we head off into the holiday season and take a few weeks break, it's really important that when we talk about the foundations of Zionism, as we have been, and the foundations of Israel, and what the definition of Israel is, as has been our discussion for the previous 3 weeks. Today, we want to introduce the sort of other side of the equation, and in particular, the definition of anti-Zionism, because if there's such a thing as Zionism, it only takes one quick search on the web to find more articles that talk about what is anti-Zionism than talk about what is Zionism. So in order for us to learn a little bit more about why that is the case, we're going to be studying today a little bit about the questions of where do we go from here. So I want to keep that in mind, that we've defined so far what is Israel and what is Zionism, or the sort of historical and political underpinnings of Zionism. And today we're going to talk a little bit about anti-Zionism, or the sort of like counter argument. And then that's going to help us kind of like move into the next level of conversation of like, okay, great. So we have something that's contentious and is not easily solved. So how are we going to not only discuss it in a responsible, mature manner, but also how to identify the sort of features of the conversation that will make the conversation better, that might help us create greater understanding, as opposed to just continuing to replicate or to recycle the arguments that have been plaguing the conversation or the question of Israel since its inception. So that's what we have in our text today, which I sent. Thank you for your understanding a little bit later this morning, and just because it's really good stuff. And so if you wanted to have it printed out, it's there. And anybody who needs a little bit more time with the text, just give me a nudge, and I'll make sure that they get to you sooner. Okay? So let's take a peek and see what we've got. All right. Can you all see this okay? Good. All right, so the first thing is, it's a quote by Martin Luther King Jr. So remember, civil rights activist, right, 1960s, and like so much of this conversation, which we're going to be addressing later on in the class, of how the conversation about Israel is sometimes blended into the conversation about civil rights, human rights in general, and how that can be a strength, but it also, at least in many respects in the current moment, is it's a disadvantage. There's a detriment to the conversation when it's intersected, that's the sort of like technical term, with other civil rights causes. And so here is Martin Luther King, who was a proud civil rights leader in the United States, but also had a thought when people were talking about how things were happening, what things were happening in Israel. Remember, this was like before the war in 1967. It's after the 56 war, so there's still a little bit of this like détente between the Arab nations and Israel, but it's like simmering pressure. So there was a lot of feelings of anti-Israel sentiment that weren't necessarily manifest in military response, but there were definitely political pushes. So he says, when approached by a student who attacked Zionism, to say like the whole Zionist project is bad, Dr. King responded, when people criticize Zionists, they mean Jews. You're talking anti-Semitism. So I thought, first of all, that was a really important artifact to bring into this, and to recognize that when we are having this conversation about what is Zionism, there is a distinction that we need to make, and in our own minds, but also in the conversations that we have, of where is the line between Judaism and anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism and anti-Zionism. And when we can figure out that distinction, that helps us in our conversations. So first, let's read a little bit. Pam, you up for reading? Great. Okay, let's try to distinguish. This is an important piece. What are we talking about when we're talking about Jews? Are we talking about a nation? Is it are Jews Israelis? Are Israelis Jews? You know, it's you would say, of course Israelis are Jews. Well, not necessarily, right? Not besides the fact that there are Israeli Arabs and there are Israeli Christians and there are Israeli Taiwanese and all kinds of other people that are members of the state of Israel, but they're not Jewish. But even people who might identify by their cultural heritage of Judaism, are they Jewish? Is a great question, because there might not be anything that distinguishes them as particularly Jewish other than they are a member of the state of Israel. So Pam, read for us, what is the distinction between Jews being a nation or a religion?
Judaism can be thought of as being simultaneously a religion, a nationality, and a culture. Throughout the Middle Ages and into the 20th century, most of the European world agreed that Jews constituted a distinct nation. This concept of nation does not require that a nation have neither a territory nor a government, but rather it identifies as a nation any distinct group of people with a common language and culture. Only in the 19th century did it become common to assume that each nation should have its own distinct government. That is the political philosophy of nationalism. In fact, Jews had a remarkable degree of self-government until the 19th century. So long as Jews lived in their ghettos, they were allowed to collect their own taxes, run their own courts, and otherwise behave as citizens of a landless and distinctly second-class nation.
Great. So pause for a second before we go on to the next pieces. So first of all, we talked about this in previous weeks. The whole concept that motivated Theodore Herzl, in addition to the pogroms of 1903 in Kishinev, where he once again witnessed, or 1894, and he witnessed he witnessed the trial of Alfred Dreyfus, right? That all of these moments were also in the backdrop was this concept that the rest of the world was creating nation states. And part of it was actually due to American nationalism. The idea that it had separated itself from the monarchy, and the French Republic had also kind of done its own revolution and independence. So there was, in this period, in the broadest scope called the Enlightenment period, when people were recognizing that there were certain identifying features that would transcend cultural or spiritual boundaries and really did kind of create what we would come to know as political or national boundaries, that the Jewish people saw that they needed to have it for themselves. Because no matter where the Jewish person was in every other culture and every other state in the world, they were always subject to. And this point is really great. As long as that Jew was in the ghetto in the early periods of the Enlightenment, no problem, except in 1903. What happened in 1903? The Kishinev massacres, the pogroms in Europe, right? And that was the beginning those were the things that were the beginning of the Holocaust, that even the Jews living in their ghettos, minding their own business, maybe interacting with the rest of the world with some commercial enterprises, but for the most part, keeping to themselves, that still wasn't good enough for the world, and there was all kinds of violence that was affected against the Jewish people. So they decided, we need a place where we can determine our own destiny. Please continue.
Of course, Judaism is a religion, and it is this religion that forms the central element of the Jewish culture that binds Jews together as a nation. It is the religion that defines foods as being kosher and non-kosher, and that underlies Jewish cuisine. It is the religion that sets the calendar of Jewish feast and fast days, and it is the religion that has preserved the Hebrew language. Is Judaism an ethnicity? In short, not anymore. Although Judaism arose out of a single ethnicity in the Middle East, there have always been conversions into and out of the religion. Thus, there are those who may have been ethnically part of the original group who are no longer part of Judaism, and those of other ethnic groups who have converted into Judaism. If you are referring to a nation in the sense of race, Judaism is not a nation. People are free to convert into Judaism. Once converted, they are considered the same as if they were born Jewish. This is not true for a race.
Okay, thank you very much, right? So Let's sort of like unpack that. What is Judaism? Is it a nation? Is it a religion? Is it more than a religion? Is it more than a nation? What is it? And this is confusing. Like I'm sure, I am sure that the only people that spend as much time thinking about it in the sort of academic circles are the Jews, right? It's not like, and in fact, we would be troubled if there was another group that was talking about the Jews with as much fervor and as much sort of like complexity if they weren't Jewish. Do you guys know the Mark Twain? Have you ever seen this concerning the Jews? If you have them, I'll put it in. I'll put the thing. He wrote an essay in 1899 called "Concerning the Jews," and he talks about the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans and all the other sort of like national heritage, national communities that existed throughout history. And he's sort of like, in short, he says the Jew has seen them all, has been a part of them all, has been persecuted by them all, and yet the Jew remains. And he asks this wonderful question. He says, what's the secret to his immortality? Right? It's probably because we complain about ourselves so much, I would say. Like, if I met Mark Twain, it was like, we only care about because we try to figure out who we are. We don't know who we are. So according to this piece, what are we talking about? It's really important. Just help us sort of put it together. According to this piece, and knowing if somebody was to ask you, right, you're on the street and you've met somebody, believe it or not, there still are many people in this world that have never met a Jewish person and know nothing about Judaism. We are 0.2 of the world population, 0.2%, okay? A fraction of a fraction, not even a statistical anomaly. That's how small these people are in the world, okay? What would you say to them? How would you define it?
It's messy.
So that's right. So what does it mean to be Jewish? And you're like, it's messy, which by the way would not be wrong. It's not a very satisfying answer, but I love it.
I think if you have to pick one of the choices, that it's a religion, and
Okay.
that some people are more actively religious, what I call praying Jews, as opposed to more people that identify their religion as being Jewish, but they're more culturally Jewish.
Right, or you could say, even in that, you don't have to distinguish religion and culture, because religion is a culture. It's the concept of identifying, say, Judaism is a religion, right? Which means that it has a common cultural language. Okay, it even has its own sort of spoken language, but there are cultural ways, right? Kosher, not kosher, as in the little piece that we just read. Holidays, time, right? And a system of ethics, right? These are all things that are defined by the religion of Judaism. Okay, so you meet somebody on the street and they're like, "What is Judaism?" And you're like, "Well, it's this messy sort of mishmash of all these different things." Okay, which would not be wrong. What else would you say? It's a great answer, Barbara.
I think I might say that it's a people that believes in one God, and we follow a Torah with our rules and regulations, and we are the people of the book.
Okay, great. So you added, right? And I think it's a great piece. You said we're the people of the book, which by the way is a name that was ascribed to us by Muslims. Okay? And we embrace it, right? Because what we're saying behind that is we have a history, right? So it's not just like religion. The Jewish religion is not just a sort of like momentary expression of identity. It is an identity that has its roots in history, which is to say that we are Abraham, we are Moses, we are Miriam and Deborah, and we are Moses Maimonides, and we are Rabbi Sally Priesand. We are Rabbi Harold M. Schulweis. We are all of these people that have comprised the history of Judaism throughout the generations, and we are the people of that, right? I just want to add it. Like, what does it say to being the people of the book? It doesn't mean that we have a book. It actually says we are the people of the book, right? That's kind of beautiful. and enervating, because we read some of the stories and we're like, I don't know if I want to really be David's people, right? Like he didn't do always great things. Jay?
Well, I agree that we're a religion and a nation, and a culture. But I also think because we've been a minority all these years and been moved into ghettos, et cetera, we're also what the world thinks of us, unfortunately. For example, in Germany, the Germans felt during World War II, the Germans said, we're German, we fought in World War I, we're not going to be attacked. And the word Germany, and this has been a pattern through the world, they view us as a certain way. And because we're a minority, we have to deal with that. We have to, fight that, I guess. And I think that's also one of the reasons why we've survived all these years, because we've been pushed together where maybe we wouldn't be if we weren't hated so much.
Oh, very good points. That last point is also like a So one thing I would just be clear, because we need to make a distinction. Nation and religion aren't the same. Okay, I know that as you were articulating it, but let's be clear. We need to separate them out. They're actually different. As the first paragraph defined. However, what you said, which is really important, is because we are a minority, we are always going to be defined by others, because if you were to say, but here's the thing, the pushback, if you were to say that the definition is dependent upon a majority consensus understanding, the Jewish people would never, ever, ever have a majority to understand and to define itself, right? Because it's just not a majority of any human population that's existed in the world. Now, that might be hard for us to wrestle because we're proud people and we have so many amazing, valuable contributions that we bring to the world. And so we might say that part of our definition is always going to be, at the very least, I want to soften what you said. At the very least, it has to be, it has to respond to the definitions of others that put upon us. And I would just add positively that we're living in a time where identity, I mean, this is an extraordinary time in the evolution of human community, where identity is located within the self, right? We define who we are not because of somebody else. Like, and you say, okay, you're a Jew because you look like a Jew, right? Like, no, you don't get to define me. We live in the world that says you don't get to define me. Okay, and part of that is because of the harrowing consequences of Nazi Germany, let alone some of the other catastrophes that are even still in existence. Talk about the Rohingya or the Uyghurs or any other sort of minority class, the Yazidi, right? That they are a minority class that is defined coercively by a majority culture, and yet they define themselves differently. Go ahead, Jay, respond to it, please.
Yeah, I think that because of Israel, we are better now at not being a victim of other people's definition. We have an army behind us now, so that's why Israel's so important. The world can hate us, but they can't send us into the gas chambers anymore because we have Israel.
Yeah. You know what? I mean, I get chills down my back because of what you just said there, which is the other side. So you would actually go, that's the definition of a nation, right? The right to self-determination. That's what Theodore Herzl saw. He said, we need to be in a place where we can only make the decision about what's going to happen to us. And then we're not going to be responsible to another nation's definition of us. That's no longer our responsibility, right? And what a brilliant moment when he saw Alfred Dreyfus, who was the pinnacle of French citizenship, right? He was an officer in the army. And when they said traitor, they meant Jew. And he was exonerated, by the way. It's not that he was a traitor. Anything else? Sherry, is that a hand or no? Oh, okay. All right. Yes, Judy. I'm going to change your name because I like Gil, but I like your name better.
Oh, I can, okay. I just responding to Jay, I think the fact that it's brought us more together is a secondary gain, and that is like the gain of the upside of the Holocaust and everything else is that now we have, a place and are a stronger people. Not that it was worth it, but it is a secondary gain.
No, I think it's a really important piece. And as we progress through this class, the reason why we're stopping and pausing here to talk about this is that as we progress with this class, it's very important that we identify the points that distinguish what is it that we mean when we talk about Judaism and we talk about Israel. Okay, because we wouldn't want to talk about Israel, and we might want to talk about the boundaries. We might want to talk about the politics. Well, we might want to talk about the religious aspects of it. And as Pam correctly pointed out, it's messy, but it's being able to articulate those definitions on all of those levels is essential.
I don't know if you're watching Ken Burns' documentary now.
I am not, but Barbara just put that in the chat.
Yeah, it's so great. And it keeps making me think of
Mhm.
how much has evolved since the Holocaust as a result of it.
Yeah, 100% right. Thank you for putting that out. And it's all the more so why our learning is relevant. And I hope we continue to sort of like gain a lot of insight from what we're learning together, because I think it's almost as if we have to create new definitions. And besides creating new definitions, we actually have to like live out those definitions. And we're in such a tumultuous time, which we've still kind of been responding to the cataclysm of the Holocaust and the cataclysm of the founding of the state. We might have definitions, but we haven't lived them fully yet. Right? I am so interested to think about what the Jewish people will be like in 200 to 300 years from now. Right? I hope all
you see it.
Yeah, I know, me too, right? Well, you know what? We're also making some pretty amazing strides in medical advances, so we might be able to yet. But if we live forever, who's going to be alive when it's time for us? And it's just a big mess, right? It would be a big mess. All right, are you guys ready to go on? Thanks, that was fun. All right, let's move on. And now, Judy, would you like to read? If there's Zionism, then of course there has to be anti-Zionism. Oh, but you have to unmute yourself.
I can read a little because I don't have much of a voice.
I'll let you read like 2 paragraphs and then we'll go to somebody else.
Naturai Karta, Aramaic for Guardians of the City, is a group of Orthodox Jews which rejects Zionism and the establishment of the state of Israel. They believe that the true Israel can only be reestablished with the coming of the Messiah. They number some 5,000 and are concentrated in Judaism.
In Jerusalem.
What?
In Jerusalem.
Oh, Jerusalem, sorry. Other larger groups associated with Neturei Karta, but not members of the group, can be found in Israel, London, New York City, and upstate New York. I can't read anymore.
No problem. Barbara?
For the most part, the members of Neturei Karta are descended from Hungarian Jews that settled in Jerusalem's Old City in the early 19th century. They were tradesmen and craftsmen who devoted most of their time to studying the Talmud and other sacred texts. Most of their livelihood was based on the halakha, or distribution of charitable donations from wealthy Jews in the diaspora. In the late 19th century, they participated in the creation of new neighborhoods outside the city walls to alleviate overcrowding in the old city. And most are now concentrated in the neighborhood of Batai, Ungarin, and the larger Meir Sharim neighborhood.
Okay, great. So just so we're seeing so far, this is a little bit of a history about the Neturei Karta. How many of you have heard of the Neturei Karta before? No? Okay, so this is huge, right? I'm glad for those of you that are shaking your head, this is like an important part of this. So you thought that, like, didn't you think that Judaism is not only a religion, is not only a nation, but anybody who agrees with Judaism is considered to be Jewish, right? Well, here is a group that is actually completely undermining the very national concept of Israel, the very Zionist project of creating a national entity in Jerusalem, and they live in Meir Sharim. They actually appreciate the social services that the state of Israel provides them: water, sewage, trash collection, medical care, all kinds of things that they, it's not like they totally take care of themselves, right? They're using the system, but they're at the same time using the system. They are, quote, also completely invalidating it. All right, so let's try to read a little bit more.
Oh, that makes no sense.
Oh, it's so great. I'm telling you, people, this doesn't make any sense. Go ahead.
Definition of messy, huh?
Yeah.
Jews that settled in Jerusalem's old city in the early 19th century. Oh, blah, blah, blah. I'm sorry. I'm reading on the screen, and that's where it started. So
Among the proofs.
Among the proofs they brought for this argument was a Talmudic midrash that God, the Jewish people, and the nations of the world made a divine pact when the Jews were sent into exile by the Roman Empire. One provision of the pact was that the Jews would not rebel against the non-Jewish world that gave them sanctuary. A second was that they would not immigrate en masse to the land of Israel. In return, the legend states, the Gentile nations promised not to persecute the Jews too harshly. By rebelling against this pact, they argued the Jewish people were engaging in open rebellion against God.
Okay, just go ahead. So wait, actually, you know what? It's a good place to stop. Let's stop. Okay. So the Neturei Karta they have a foundation of belief that is based in a Talmudic understanding. The Talmud is emerged largely as a post-exilic text, and its responsibility in part was to preserve Judaism. And they were trying to ask the question, like, well, how long is exile going to last? Because the last time the Jews were exiled, they were only exiled for 70 years. So how is it, or 100 years, right? So how is it that, how long are the Jewish people going to wait? Diaspora was indefinite. And the only time that the Jews were going to be able to return to the land was when the Messiah came. Okay? Know what's happening historically at the same time? There's no messianic concept really before the Roman period. Who is the singular most significant figure that is killed by the Roman authorities around this time in history? Jesus. And guess who his devoted followers think is going to come and be resurrected and return all of the exiles back into Israel? Jesus. So there is this concept in the fracturing of Judaism with the rest of the world that says we also have a belief that we're only going to get to return to the land, but it's made by a pact with God, a pact with us, a pact with the rest of the nations of the world that we won't ever return until the Messiah comes. And in exchange, the other nations won't deal with us too harshly. Well, you could argue right there, which I'm sure that your mind is doing, because I did it the first time I read it, is like, too harshly, like, at what point did any of the horrible things that had been happening to the Jewish people all throughout history until this founding of the state ever qualify as not too harshly, right? It was horrible. So there were plenty of times when Jews lived in peace, and I'm not diminishing that, but there was more times as well in which Jews suffered greatly. So the Neturei Karta says, look, nobody's written, God hasn't come back, the pact was made. So even though it seems harsh to us, God didn't think that it was too harsh. Did you hear that? God did not think it was too harsh. That would be the argument of Neturei Karta. It's also the argument of the Bible. The Bible is like, God is so mad with us, and God is so upset with us. And Barbara writes a great question in the chat. She says, well, why don't they go, right? So where would they go, right? Where would they go? Exactly. Where would they go? So you have one of the groups that is, famously anti-Zionist is the Satmar Hasidim. We'll be reading about them in just a moment, okay? And the Satmar Hasidim are largely located in New York. If you notice, the number of people who are the invalidators of the state of Israel only number around, at least according to this text, 5,000. Okay, so this is a population of 9 million people, 9 million people, and 5,000 of them don't agree with the state. Do you know how many people actually don't believe in the United States right now today? Like literally, and it's a joke and serious. right? Do you know how many like little like backwater militias there are of people that are preparing for the next civil revolution, right? Yeah, there's a lot. Okay, and we saw it rear its ugly head a year ago, as there was this sort of like what do we call uprising at the Capitol. Okay, and so the fact that there are groups, you would say, well, why do they leave, right? Well, first of all, where would they go, right? And also, Barbara, here's the other point. There's something unbelievably validating about the freedom to disagree that is part of this story, right? As much as we want to say that like Zionist, in order to be a Zionist, you have to like agree with it, unequivocally. That's just not it. Just like, you know what, if you're an American, you don't have to agree with everything that's American. You don't, right? But that doesn't mean that if you disagree that you should leave.
I have a question.
Yeah. Go ahead.
This group, why are they anti-Zionists? Because they're super religious.
Yes, and?
So why are they anti-Zionists?
No, they're anti-Zionist because they're super religious, and because in their religious identity, it says that the Jewish people are not allowed to return en masse to the state of Israel until the Messiah comes, right?
Until the Messiah.
That is their religious belief.
Okay.
Right, and so therefore, let's read on a little bit more. Speaking of reading on, Jay, you want to pick it up and read a little bit?
Sure. Where are we?
Oh, okay, great. So we are, in fact, this position
was adopted by the bulk of the Orthodox world, with the exception of a small faction of Orthodox Zionists, led by Chief Rabbi Abraham Kook and his followers. Well up until the United Nations voted to partition Palestine on November 29, 1947, representatives of another Orthodox party, Agudat Israel, actually asked the General Assembly to vote against partition.
Do you guys hear that, right? Did you see that, right? So there is a group that is still functioning, that still exists today in Israel, that does have representation in the parliament, that at the time of the founding of state in 1947, when they created partition plan in November of 1947, they said, don't do it, okay?
Tensions were at their highest between the Zionist and non-Zionist Jewish communities in Palestine in the 1920s, following the assassination of Jacob de Haan, a Dutch poet, former Zionist, and spokesman for Agudat Israel against the creation of a Jewish state. Nevertheless, Agudat Israel reevaluated its position upon the establishment of Israel and has been a participant in most governments since that time, though it still will not accept a ministerial portfolio as a result.
So Agudat Israel, which is a faction, it's a bloc. They actually do participate in the government, okay? But look at what happened to them. So this guy, I think he was a rabbi, Jacob de Haan, Dutch poet, former Zionist, right? Was a spokesman to say, I'm not anti-Zionist, I'm non-Zionist, not yet. Not yet in 1920. And then he was assassinated. So that just made it really awful. Okay. All right, go ahead. Switch of allegiance.
This switch of allegiance by Agudat Israel caused a radical shift in the ideology of Neturei Karta, which felt betrayed by their Orthodox allies. Their attacks against Israel and Zionism became all the more extreme, especially under the leadership of Rabbi Amram Blau and his wife, a convert and former member of the French resistance, who had rescued Blau during the Holocaust. This community became more insular while forming alliances with the other sects that rejected the pragmatic support given by Agudat Israel to Israel's secular government after independence. Among their allies were the large and affluent Hasidic group Satmar under the leadership of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, formerly of Hungary and later of New York City, as well as other Hasidic groups, some in Israel and others in the diaspora. With their help, Neturei Karta was able to withstand paying taxes to the state that they did not recognize, and conversely to avoid obtaining any benefits from that state by revitalizing the halakha distribution of funds that characterized earlier generations. As such, they became a self-contained community within Israel with few formal ties to the surrounding political infrastructure.
Okay, go ahead one more time.
While
One more.
many in Neturei Karta chose to simply ignore the state of Israel, a fringe element took proactive steps to condemn it and bring about its eventual dismantling until the coming of the Messiah. Chief among these is Rabbi Moshe Hirsch, Neturei Karta's self-proclaimed foreign minister who serves in Yasser Arafat's cabinet as Minister for Jewish Affairs.
All right, so do you guys get that? Woohoo! Hold on a second.
This is crazy.
Let's just pause for a second before we get to the end, right? All right, so what do we read? So Neturei Karta, it's, you know, there's an argument about how many people are really like anti-Zionist. Well, part of it is that, you know, you've got the people that live in Israel, which number 5,000, and then you have all these other places in the world like the Satmar Hasidim. I don't know the exact numbers, but it's not small, right? They're a significant community as well. So you have these like huge communities outside of Israel, in London and New York and, you know, all other parts of the world. And they're also sort of subscribing to the belief that the state of Israel does not exist, should not exist. And then you have Agudat Israel, which was sort of a non-Zionist organization, but then once there was an assassination of its leader, became a proto-Zionist organization, but still in kind of like its, you know, defiance of the spiritual belief that the state of Israel, that the people are not allowed to return to Israel en masse unless the Messiah brings them there. That's still something that they maintain. So then there's like even these like greater levels, like including this guy Hirsch, who goes and was serving. This is an older article. Was serving in Yasser Arafat's, the Palestinian Liberation Organization's cabinet of Ministry for Jewish Affairs. He was the link between the Palestinian people and the Jewish people. It's like, you know, just, do you guys remember Mahmoud Ahmadinejad? Right? You remember that guy? Right? He was like hard to pronounce his name, but he like certainly hated Israel more than the current president of Israel, right? For sure. And he invited members of Neturei Karta, and they shook hands, and they formed alliances on the belief that the state of Israel should not exist. That's part of what Neturei Karta accomplishes. Not only does it hold a belief, but it also makes alliances with, you know, potentially dangerous governments and nations who seek the destruction of the Jewish people, to seek the destruction of Israel. But actually, I slipped up. Seek the destruction of Israel, may not necessarily believe that they want the destruction of the Jewish people. They just don't want Israel to exist in that land, period. Okay? Any thoughts, comments, reactions? Yes, Lori. You got to unmute. Yeah.
So what happens as the religious become more and more in numbers and the secular Jews in Israel become less and less? Where will Israel be?
So that's a big, huge what if, And I would say, first of all, it's not a certainty that there will be more. There are demographic shifts that say that there are increasing numbers of observant Orthodox communities, but not every Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox community is anti-Israel. It just happens to be that this is a sort of like, you know, sect. And while there is this belief that, you know, the people cannot return to Israel en masse unless the Messiah comes, well, that is a long way away, Lori, right? Because the current world Jewish population is split between North America, largely North America and Israel. And then there's other places in the world where Jews live. But Jews live all around the world. And the great Hasidic missionary, if you will, organization, Chabad, is a Hasid. They're Hasidic, and they go all over the world, and they create places to welcome Jews into Judaism. And they are absolutely supportive of the state of Israel. Absolutely supportive, and will protect and defend it in the most positive way. Sherry, was there something there?
Remind me once again, how will they know when the Messiah is coming?
Oh, that's good. Well, the Talmud has it beautifully. If somebody comes to announce, if you're planting a tree and somebody comes to announce that the Messiah has come, you finish planting the tree. And then you go and see the news, hear the news about the Messiah coming. What's the point? We don't know when the Messiah is going to come, but we know that there's still a lot of work for us to do before that time happens. So there are a lot of people that would say, we're just bad. We're never good enough. We're never going to be good enough. And the Messiah is going to come and save us all. Okay?
Isn't world peace one of them?
Right. Or like, a total world destruction, right? I mean, if you talk to Christians, and some of the evangelical Christians, they'll tell you that they are also sort of messianic and believe in a second coming of Jesus, and they want Jews to come in Israel. They want the return of the Jews to Israel, right? Because there is this mindset that upon that return, then the Messiah will come and kill everybody who doesn't believe in Jesus.
Mm.
Well, we Jews are too stubborn to ever believe in Jesus. We've proven that. We've proven that. Okay. Any other points? All right, let's go on to the next one. Let's see. Actually, we're almost finished with this. So, Jay, you want to read it?
Sure. Hirsch and his followers oppose Israel on religious grounds. Devoutly committed to their faith, they reject Jews who do not share their level of observance as heretics. Nevertheless, they also maintain that an Orthodox community of Jews can and should be a viable minority in an Arab-dominated Palestinian state. According to their ideology, the Jews were first sent into exile for their sins so that a secular Jewish presence in Israel could be grounds for further expulsions and exile. At their most extreme, they claim that the Holocaust was divine punishment for the sins of secular Jews. But at the same time, they also believe that the time will come when all Jews will repent, will be lost, and the Messiah will come to redeem them. Their website claims that the Zionists deliberately condemned thousands of Jews to die in Nazi gas chambers rather than allow them to emigrate to destinations other than Palestine in order for the Zionists to claim a Zionist state. They also claim that the mass media deliberately downplays their viewpoint and makes them out to be just a few, while there are a large number of Jews with the same beliefs.
Thank you very much. Okay, so, whoo, boy, I don't know if anybody's blood is boiling a little bit, but if anybody's ever participated in AIPAC, which is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and it's not a political action committee, it's a public affairs committee, and they raise awareness and education. They do act as kind of like a political action thing, and they raise money for political candidates, and they're part of the political system. But they have this gigantic conference. I haven't seen it in a couple of years because I think COVID has kind of shut it down. But the conference, like 18,000 people descend upon Washington, D.C. for a couple of days. And every time that they gather, with that unconditionally is a group that stands outside across the street with their Israel doesn't exist, and you guys are ruining the Jewish people, and you should be condemned, right? So you say, again, here's one of the most active gatherings of the Jewish people in the world at this time in history, and there's somebody who's expressing opposition. So what is it that we get here? Anti-Zionism is not just from people who hate Jews, right? Because these are people that are Jews, right? They're not just Jews, they're religious Jews, if you will. So the definition of what is Israel or what is a Jewish person, it can't exclusively be about religious identity. It can't just exclusively be about your belief in the sort of cultural practices. Because you can believe in the cultural practices of Judaism, but if you don't believe in the sort of national practices of Judaism in this time, then you are in some way effectively a participant in this ideology. Now that's dramatic, and you might want to bristle at that. You're like, I'm not so sure about Israel, and no. And like, yeah, it's fine to be questioning the identity of Israel, but to deny its existence is in a way to participate in this ideology. And that says to me, as I think that this would be what I conclude, that says to us that you cannot be anti-Zionist and you cannot be anti-Zionist and fully Jewish. Or let me say it the other way, positively. To be fully Jewish is to be in some way a Zionist. That's what I think is being said right here. Any comments and responses to that? It's an interesting thing, because you're going to talk with people and you'll be out in the world when we talk about this, like, all right, so you're having a conversation with your 20 something grandchild or child, right? And they're like, well, I don't know about Israel, they oppress, it's apartheid state, all these people hate them.
Yes.
Right? Like it's there in the water. And the sort of like force of what I just said would not land positively on somebody. However, it's I do think that part of the conversation has to be defined of like, what is your Jewish identity? And if you say that I have a cultural identity, well, that culture comes from this religious background, this historical background, and that includes this place. And even if that's not the place that you think the Jewish people should live in the world, you cannot deny that that place exists. And you cannot deny that that place is important for people. And there's something to be said with people who are questioning it. By and large, they won't say, like, I don't think it's not important. I'm not happy with it. Well, I'm not happy with the Jewish people either. Okay, Sherry.
I think the conversation with these children, grandchildren, is more how they see the Palestinians being treated. So we seem to have come to a very happy medium. And I think a lot of people want, a two-state solution, including, the United States. So that's where.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about that in the next pieces. So that's really important so right now, what we've done is, this is like in Israel against itself. And now we're going to talk about the other conversation, which is a really, really important part of the conversation, and that's the American perception of Israel, which but it could also be the sort of like Anglo perception, because we're going to read an article from The Guardian, which is a London-based newspaper. It happens to be an American author who wrote the piece, but it was published in the London major news article. Judy.
Back to the text, I'm always puzzled by claiming that the Holocaust was divine punishment for the sins of secular Jews, when a lot of these guys were killed too. And so how do you explain that? And my other comment is, my daughter went to Israel on birthright 20 years ago. And they were all having a discussion about Zionism. And she questioned it because she wanted to discuss another side of it. And they all jumped on her until she was in tears. And she came home and she goes, I don't know if I want to be Jewish.
Right.
So you can come on way too strong.
Yeah, right. Like, thank you for saying that. And like I said, in my comment, the last thing that somebody who is questioning wants to hear is, is indisputable, unconditional affirmation of Zionism and the Jewish state. And would base it and bristles at any criticism that comes from it. I would say that the reason that exists, if I were to try and analyze it, would be that that is born out of a trauma. That's a trauma-based response, and these are people that see that, or that response is based out of the fear for the historical consequences of the Jew in the world before this, particularly before the state of Israel, And now that there is a state, they would say we have to defend against it at all costs. And that includes totally disregarding. Now, the irony of the moment, Judy, is that like I said, anybody who does a little bit of research finds that this debate is all over the place. Jews are talking about it, non-Jews are talking about it, Jews talk about it more. Jews are more concerned about the way that other people think about us and the way that we think about ourselves than any other sort of people thinks about us. And that's significant. It's significant for us to consider. But the other piece that I wanted to add that I thought was, in what you said, which is really great and really important, is that when we talk about like what does it mean to be anti-Zionism, that doesn't, first of all, that seems to be like a line that is crossed when you deny the existence of the state. And most of the time, look at the numbers, most of the time, that is not a line where people sit on both sides. So that will be sort of a good place for us to take a pause. Any other comments and responses to that? Good. Let's take a pause. It's a little bit early, but it's good to pause here because the next two articles that we read are going to help us define how anti-Semitism, one side says anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism or vice versa, and the other one would say anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. And we'll study that together in about 5 minutes. Okay?
About.
Yeah.
Are they in favor of only having a Palestinian state where some Jews can live but not identify with the state? Is that their goal?
So, well, that's what they said in that last paragraph. If
That's
you saw
what I read in that last paragraph.
So it's so interesting because is it, the real question is what state, a Palestinian state, and we're going to have to talk about that. We'll get to one state, two state. And so what does it mean? And the Palestinian people, were they ever a statistical majority in the, like, it's a fascinating and complicated part of the story. But basically they said in what that article said was Arab. Meaning that it could be any sort of ethnic group that would take over the sort of leadership of that. Okay, but now that's a really great thing to keep in mind because look at what happens when we start talking about what would be some of the consequences if there wasn't a state of Israel that was the fruition, the outcome of the Zionist project. So let's see that. Here we go. And this is from Jonathan Greenblatt, who, as you may know, his name is familiar. He is the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League. He was having this, it's a fascinating, and I highly recommend interview that was in the New Yorker just a few months ago. And it's all about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And the reason why I say it's fascinating is because it's not, a real friendly, it's not friendly. Like there are parts where it starts to get real tight in the argument. We're going to see a little bit of that now. I brought a couple excerpts of it because I want us to see what does it mean to say that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Remember the quote that we read at the beginning of class today with Martin Luther King saying it? Well, this is what a lot of people feel when you talk about anti-Zionist elements. Roberta S., do you feel like reading?
Sure.
Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Interview with Jonathan Greenblatt. In that speech, you said to those who still cling to the idea that anti-Semitism is not, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. Let me clarify this for you clearly as I can. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. I will repeat, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. How are you using the term anti-Zionism? Well,
Great question, right? Go ahead.
Well, it's not my term per se. It's a philosophy of negation. It's an idea that is based upon negating Zionism. And Zionism is the right of Jewish people to self-determination in their ancestral homeland. This right of self-determination that many in the anti-Zionist camp want for Palestinians or would want for other peoples, they would deny to Jewish people. Unless you don't believe in nationalism as a concept, and unless you support denying the legitimacy of any national project from France to Ukraine, if you hold the idea that Zionism is the only form of nationalism, that's wrong. That's discriminating against Jewish people. That's the anti-Semitism. I say this as someone who believes in a two-state solution and who's taken flack for it in some quarters of the more right-wing segments of the Jewish community. I believe in Palestinian nationalism, and I believe in Zionism, and if you will, Jewish nationalism. These things are not at odds with each other. So in theory, there's some people, whether you're a pundit or a columnist or a professor, who might think it's fine to hold this idea. But in reality, as you can see in our latest data, the conflation of anti-Semitism with other forms, anti-Zionism, with other forms of politics is actually quite dangerous to Jewish people of all persuasions.
Okay, great. So I'm sad because I know that Roberta Pepkowitz would like really want this, and now that she knows that she's on the video and watching this, we'd be like, "Hi, we miss you," because I know that when we started thinking about what this course was about, it's precisely this point that is it's the stickiest part of the conversation. And it's important to identify it now, because what we're looking to do is to establish what are our definitions so that we may enable a conversation. What Jonathan Greenblatt has simply said is that anti-Zionism, by definition, is saying that there is not allowed, there should be no place where any particular people ever has a right to its own self-determination. In a recent article, I think it's even today, that came out that said, we need to support those in Ukraine because they are asserting their right to self-determination. And that's what we are in support of. And which, by the way, you will hear in the halls of Congress, the United States Congress, an unconditional support for Ukraine, because it is also the same idea. We believe in nationalism, and if we believe in nationalism for us, say the Americans, then we have to believe in it for the Jews in Israel, and then we have to believe for it the Ukrainians. And you know what? We're even going to have to believe for it in people where it's a little bit questionable, like in Taiwan. Where it's really a hotbed and China doesn't want to accept it, let alone some of the other places where it's really, really complicated there. So here's what Jonathan Greenblatt says, and I want you to hold on to it, and I want us to think about it, is that if you are talking to somebody and they're saying there should not be a Jewish state and there should not be any states altogether, then you say, oh, I know who I'm talking to. I'm talking to an anti-colonialist, an anti-imperialist, somebody who is, has an ideological opposition to any kind of like form of governmental authority that's ever existed in history, certainly in modern history. And so therefore, that's who I'm talking to. You know what? You don't have to have the conversation about Israel with them because it doesn't matter. That's not what they're interested in. But if they're interested in not having Israel, and not any other conversation, then Jonathan Greenblatt comes down pretty hard on this and says that is anti-Semitism. Now, Judy, when your daughter went to Israel on birthright, one of the things that makes this so darn upsetting is that she, and I don't know how educated she is, but her questions may have come from a place of ignorance. I'm not saying that she's not very smart, because I know your kid, smart, super smart, but ignorance about this conversation. And the problem that we have on the inside is that where there is ignorance, we have a penchant as Jews to kind of like, say, oh, you don't know, well, let me tell you what you don't know, and no. Like that sort of makes our argumentation what it is. And it's actually really problematic, especially when we get to sensitive issues. Because then what you get, as we're about to read, is you're gonna get an equal and opposite reaction. Just like what Jay said, as much as Jews are defined by the larger world out there of us, and there is this impulse in the 21st century to say that meaning is located within the self, so too does the quest to kind of like broaden our understanding of definitions and expectations of identities that exist in this world, and overcoming those biases in a respectful and tolerant manner. It is very hard out there. Judy.
Okay, respectful and tolerant are the operative words, because she did have a level of ignorance about Zionism, I will confess. She is very educated, but I think the upshot was that because of the way they came at her, she pulled away from Judaism for a long time.
Yeah.
And so you have to be careful how you try to indoctrinate people.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for like letting me use it as an example, because I know it's personal, but it's much more common, right? What we're talking about is this is a common thread. And it's why there's so many layers of complexity. Just like when people tell you, right, if you go to a doctor's office, do you want your doctor to tell you that, like, you have some rare disease and make you feel like an idiot about it if you don't know what it is, right? Like, how horrible is it, right? We have a moral or a sort of human obligation to educate each other, right? But that's difficult because sometimes our emotions are wrapped up in it, especially when you're talking about Israel. Anyways, I thought Jonathan Greenblatt's point on this was great, and he goes back in a little bit further and has another response because like I said, it's a great article, and he doesn't just stop here. It's not like, oh, okay, great, you're, if you make anti-Zionism, the only place that you don't want a state for Jewish people to exist, then you are, quite possibly an anti-Semite too. So now let's read. Fran, do you feel like reading?
So if I were a Palestinian in the West Bank and I thought that my situation really stunk and that we should have one democratic state that covers all this territory, is that in practice anti-Semitic? No one is going to argue with you that many people who are anti-Zionists are also anti-Semitic. The people who would want a democratic state or states in that area, or would even want Israel to be a democratic state without a religious character, is that anti-Semitic?
Yeah, great question. Go ahead.
I get it. I understand what you're saying. What I'm talking about is not the Palestinian who's displaced from their village in 1948. Not talking about that. I get that as an idea, but in practice, what I'm dealing with are the students at Rutgers University who, when they read off the names of Holocaust survivors or people in their family who died during the Holocaust, their fraternity is pelted with eggs. And students who claim some fidelity to anti-Zionism or Palestinian nationalism harass them. That's a problem for me. And again, I'm not debating or questioning the authenticity of an indigenous Palestinian person who's living in the West Bank who feels impinged upon by the Israeli state. By the way, my wife's family was displaced from Iran. My grandfather's family was all slaughtered in the Holocaust. But my grandfather didn't ascribe to, and I don't ascribe to, the idea that the German state needs to be dismantled and destroyed, and that German people don't have a right to self-identity.
So I like this article. I think it was actually quite articulate, and just to sort of like absorb what he said. So the question is, right, is to say, if you have an idea that the political solution is in some way a reclamation of the refugee status of the people who are living in mandated Palestine in the 1940s before the establishment of the state of Israel, that makes you an anti-Semite. He says, no, that's not true, because just because the, if you have this idea that because there was a problem with the sort of like displacement of the people, Germans who happen to be Jewish. By the way, responding to, you know, something that Judy said earlier, right? 1/4 Jewish, or they were married to somebody who was Jewish. They were persecuted whether they were religious or secular, or they were even like closely related to that. So if there's any kind of like, which by the way, in Noah Jacoby's book, she makes a great point. She says there were X amount of people that were identified as refugees in 1948, and that number has like quadrupled, or has like, you know, turned 400 time fold. So the point being that like the argument isn't that just because that might be the case, that there needs to be a dismantling of the entire state of Germany, okay, because of the sort of wrongs that were arguably committed. It's harsh, but there's a logic to it. So the question that I think is sort of unfolding here is us trying to define what is anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism. Anti-Semitism, I think we have a pretty good definition of. What is anti-Zionism? We've studied the historical foundations, we've studied the political foundations, we've now studied this kind of like modern expression of what is considered anti-Zionism. What is it that one would identify as anti-Zionism today? How would you define that? If somebody were to say is like, you know, are you an anti-Zionist? What does that mean? Who wants to give that one a shot? Pam.
In its simplest terms, I think it means that you think the state of Israel shouldn't exist. Stop, full stop.
Full stop, period, stop. Okay, great. And do you also agree with that statement that if that's true, then there should never be another state in existence for a minority displaced people? Like, I don't know, like we said, like the Yazidis or the Uyghurs or the Rohingya, who, you know, so is that part of the definition too? In other words, like an anti-Zionist is an anti-nationalist. Or is it an anti-Zionist is an anti-Israel? I'm pushing. I put you on the spot. It's something to think about.
It's such a hard question because there isn't, you know, you could say that there should be no United States because we took over the land of the Native Americans. So, you know, let's all get up and move.
Yeah.
I mean, and where on the earth is there uninhabited, unclaimed land where a displaced people can go? We don't want them in the Santa Monica Mountains, right?
Right. Yeah.
So I don't have an answer. I don't think there's a right answer even.
Well, I think welcome to, that's it, right? Thank you for participating in that and trying to puzzle it out. And you know that there are people that they have PhDs in the subject, and if you ask them point blank the very same question, they would struggle a little bit as well. You might get some that say, this is what should happen, and those that say, this is what should happen, right? You'll have points of views and opinions, but ultimately, if you peel the layers away, everybody's kind of feeling like not exactly sure what to do here. Any other comments? Any other comments about that? What is the definition of an anti-Zionist? Are we all satisfied with Pam's definition? Somebody who doesn't want Israel and doesn't have a good answer of where the people who live there should go, right? Or would be satisfied, like the Neturei Karta, of another political entity there, right? That would, you know, which Jewish people could live there if they wanted to. Right, but they would not have like administrative authority, autonomy. You know, they wouldn't have a sort of democratic voice in the sort of rules of governance of that place. Candy or Norm, whoever's which one.
Thinking back to the Morgenthau Plan, which suggested that Germany after the war had forfeited its right to nationhood by its behavior, and that the country should be turned into one large meadowland, and the population as remains should be dispersed across the world. I'm not certain that was wrong. Can a people forego or biased behavior lose its right to national?
You know, so that's a really great addition to what Pam is saying. So there's this thought that maybe we sort of like we surgically level the playing field. It might be surgery with a saw, okay, but it's still surgical, right? And we basically like disperse everybody, kick everybody out, and like let everything kind of like lie fallow. Which, by the way, is not an unbiblical idea. This idea that like every 50 years, we're supposed to reset the ownership of the land. So this whole concept of ownership of the land might also pertain to this particular situation. Like the fascination with that particular land seems to be something that we have a hard time with. If you continue reading, and I encourage you to go deep into it, Norm, that article, one of the things that he points out is the fact that like there's that if we were to let go of the current political identity of the state of Israel and let another political entity take over, like Syria, right? Like the Syrian government, like we can only envision our fear is that it would become a tragedy because of the human rights abuses that would result. So there is also that kind of like tension that even though it's imperfect, the state of Israel is better than anything else that's existing there. Did I answer your question?
A point. Go ahead. Ask. Comment.
Can a country lose its right to exist?
Can a country lose its right to exist? That is so fascinating. I am not an expert in that, but I would love to know. I mean, could you imagine what the world would look like if that was true? Right? Like all of the things that are like absolutely abhorrent that countries do, including the United States of America. If we were to subscribe to that, what would be the consequences? I don't know. It's breathtaking. It's a breathtaking question, and I can't answer it with any authority because I am by far not an expert in that. However, it's such an interesting conversation that I would love to learn from somebody who is an expert in international law to say where are there, because there are countries that get sanctioned all the time. Look, we're dealing with Russia, Iran. It gets sanctioned by the rest of the world for its malign practices. So we have that instrument that is in effect. But can a country actually lose its right to exist? I'm telling you, that's why it's not so great. Alice, good point.
Isn't that what Putin is trying to do in Ukraine?
Absolutely, and it's why there's all of this.
Why we're fighting back.
It's why there's fighting back. And by the way, one thing that I wanted to say about it, Israel has an amazing relationship with Russia. An amazing relationship with Russia. Right? At the outbreak of the war, they were there talking to Russia saying like, what are you guys doing? Right? And we don't want to ruin that because that partnership is actually pretty darn good for us economically and strategically. Like we're trying to stay as far away as we can out of that, let alone knowing in Ukraine, the president and the prime minister are Jewish, that the population has a substantial Jewish population, that also on the other side, the largest percentage of olim, of emigres to Israel in the last year were from Ukraine and they're Jewish. That is a big, big deal that we need to take into account. Good point. All right, so is this Candy, Norm?
I'll just say that on the issue of permanence, wasn't the prophets and weren't we saying the concept that Jews lost Israel because of our conduct? Initially during the dialogue. So
yeah, exactly. Long before the era of nation states, long before there were nation states, the whole concept of the people losing the land of Israel to first the Babylonians and the Persians and then later to the destruction of the Romans and the dispersion from the land, right? In the Second Temple. That those were fully consequences in the Jewish perception, of our failure towards our fulfillment of the covenant. Now, historically, we might argue a different message, which is that these were dominating military and political forces of their time. And like, so say for example, the Roman Empire, which later, you know, at that time was the most powerful government institution on the planet, that it was just a matter of a stop along the way. And the story it's also framed in the way that it's told, which is a really great segue into the next text. Any other comments? Great, let's go into the next text. Barbara, you sure? Or is that you just quaffing your hair? Okay, great. All right. Lori, do you feel like reading a little bit?
Anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. The argument that anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic rests in three pillars. The first is that opposing Zionism is anti-Semitic because it denies to Jews what every other people enjoys, a state of its own. The idea that all other peoples can seek and defend their right to self-determination, but Jews cannot, declared US Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer in 2017 as anti-Semitism. As David Harris, head of the American Jewish Committee, put it last year, to deny the Jewish people of all the peoples on earth the right to self-determination surely is discriminatory. All the peoples on earth, the Kurds don't have their own state, neither do the Basques, Catalans, Scots, Kashmiris, Tibetans,
Abkhazians.
Asturians, Lombards, Igbo, and all these other places and peoples, nor dozens of other peoples who have created nationalist movements to seek self-determination but failed to achieve it. Yet barely anyone suggests that opposing a Kurdish or Catalan state makes you an anti-Kurdish or anti-Catalan bigot. It is widely recognized that states based on ethnic nationalism, states created to represent and protect one particular ethnic group, are not the only legitimate way to ensure public order and individual freedom. Sometimes it is better to foster civic nationalization, a nationalism built around the borders rather than heritage, to make Spanish identity more inclusive of Catalans or Iraqi identity more inclusive of Kurds rather than carving those multi-ethnic states up. You'd think Jewish leaders would understand this. You'd think that they would understand it because many of the same Jewish leaders who call national self-determination a universal right are quite comfortable denying it to Palestinians.
Okay, stop right there. Right? Whew. So if you haven't studied Peter Beinart, he is a vocal and often quoted and popular commentator on the left side of the political spectrum, and is frequently quoted for trying to articulate the anti-Israel and here in some way the anti-Zionist argument. So if we just read an article that said anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism because of the sort of like national, denying the nationalist identity of the Jewish people would be like denying the nationalist identity of the Basque in the northeast of Spain. And if you are anti the Basque, then that must mean that you are also anti-Israel and anti-Jewish. But he doesn't want to argue that. So it's interesting what he's trying to draw on this distinction. He's saying, if you are going to hold, again, the argument, if you're going to hold that there shouldn't exist to be a state of Israel, he's trying to say, if there should be a state of Israel, then there should be a state for the Basque. And are we proposing maybe to create a more inclusive state? And if we're proposing to create a more inclusive state in Israel, what would that state look like? It would include the Palestinians, which, by the way, is exactly what Peter Beinart's argument is. Okay? And we'll get to more of it in just a moment. Jay.
I think it's interesting that he uses the Spanish identity and the Iraqi identity as examples, when both of these countries threw their Jews out, along with many other nations, weren't too good to Jews.
Yeah.
That's another issue. But it just seems to me that, whether it's religious or national, that Israel was created for a very pragmatic reason. Just like when Jews came here to this country, because people defined us, they didn't like us, we couldn't join their law firms, so we created our own law firms, created our own golf courses, department stores, film industry, and we created our own country because the rest of the world didn't include us in a way that was good for our survival.
Such a great point. Such a great point. And could be brought on both sides, right? Says, look, the Jews don't need a place, right? Because wherever the Jews are, they're going to figure out how to govern themselves, right? So which we hear story after story after story of where Jewish autonomy has created Jewish institutions to care for its own and to thrive and to contribute to the world around it, right? So that's really great. So what do they need a state for? That would be the argument against it. The argument for it is there's no other place in the world that a Jew could safely be except in Israel, and so therefore it has to be this place. And then you've got that other argument which Greenblatt brought, which is that if you don't allow that little piece of land to be governed by these people with this system of ethics and civic responsibility, it will become an eternal trash heap. And we as a people cannot withstand that, right? Like the very Jewish identity, the core of our Jewish identity would be incomplete. Remember that Yehuda Halevi, my heart is in the East, but I live in the West. That heartthrob of that land and what it means to us is irreplaceable. What did you want to say, Jay?
I want to say something.
Yeah, hold on, but Jay first, because he had a.
I forgot what I was going to say.
All right, I'll come back to you later. Hopefully I said nice things. Sherry, go ahead.
Well, Jay mentioned, but does Beinart say anything about the Holocaust that this?
So that's a really good question. We would love to study Peter Beinart. One of the things that I think is convenient is that this kind of argumentation can only take place with a secure, a physically secure, a democratically run entity known as the State of Israel. You cannot write like this without the existence of the State of Israel. The comfort to be able to register this kind of argumentation can only come from it's almost as if you deny that those things were fought for and suffered for in order to create this, opportunity. That is a major critique laid at the foot of Peter Beinart.
I mean, we didn't kill 6 million, as far as I know, nobody killed 6 million Scots or 6 million Catalans.
They have their stories of, they do have their stories. So I wouldn't say and it's not even about the numerical equivalent, but there is a concept, there's another concept here, right? Which is that we're talking about ethnic groups versus a political entity. And I think that's kind of where there's a separation, right? The religious identity of a Jewish person can be anywhere in the world, right? When a Jew prays, where do they pray? They pray towards Jerusalem, right? And when you're in Jerusalem, you pray towards the wall. And when you pray, and if you're in the Holy of Holies, you pray in the Holy of Holies. There's only one place in the entire world that a Jewish person prays, right? But and it's not very clear if there are any other ethnic groups that have that kind of attachment. That's an important piece of this, right? And it was brought up earlier. So what if you just go to Alaska, right? What about Uganda? Why not Uganda? Okay. All right, let's go on a little bit further because we don't want to get inflamed by Beinart too much. Lori, do you want to read a little bit more or you feel like you're done?
I'm done. I'll listen.
Okay, great. Lauren, do you feel like reading a little bit today?
Yeah, where are you? Yet barely?
Yes.
Yet barely anyone suggests that the opposing.
I'm sorry, you right, no? Argument number 2.
argument number 2 is a variation of this theme. Maybe it is not bigoted to oppose a people's quest for statehood, but it is bigoted to take away that statehood once achieved. It is one thing to argue that the mute court of historic what ifs, that Israel should not have come into being, argued the New York Times columnist Bret Stephens earlier this month. However, Israel is now the home of nearly 9 million citizens with an identity that is distinctively and proudly Israeli, and the Dutch are Dutch or the Danes Danish. Anti-Zionism proposes nothing less than the elimination of that identity and the political disposition of those who cherish it.
Thank you very much. Right. So argument number 1 is that every national entity that seeks self-determination has a right to do it, and to deny it, especially when you're talking about Israel, Israel doesn't have a right to this, it's called anti-Semitism. And he's like, well, look at that. What if we did that for everybody else? And he actually also really was very hard about the staunch proponents of a one-state solution that is only Israel, that's saying that the Palestinian quest for statehood or identity should be denied because they're corrupt or whatever, right? Whatever reasons that you come up with. And the second argument, which is a similar variation on that, says once it's created, you can't take it away. That's Norm's argument, right? He says, can you ever take away a country's right not to exist? Well, he's like, well, wait a minute, there's all these things that are kind of out there, and he'll go on the argument and sort of lodge that it's but if it's not behaving properly, then it deserves to be criticized, right? Which I don't think anybody would deny the ability to criticize if behavior was wrong, if there's something that is causing harm. But that's what makes this complicated, is that there's this, as we talked about with the intersectionality, you have organizations that promote civil rights for other, marginalized or victimized groups, and they throw in the plight of the Palestinians, and they make it into being this sort of Zionist colonial enterprise that seeks to put a minority group under apartheid. And it's just not true. It's just not true. But the problem is that with the heaping of the argument, there is that belief. So Beinart doesn't really argue it well. I didn't give you the article. I encourage you to read it. And he sort of tries to rationalize his way through it. Jay, quickly, yes?
Today's discussion is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. And to me, it's suspicious that there's even that we have to have a class on this, that the world is obsessed with Israel versus all these other countries that are doing, horrible things around the globe. That to me is very suspicious that it's anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
It's focused on Israel. No, Germany declared 2 wars in the last, 150 years, and almost wiped out the world. And we're not saying that they shouldn't be a country, as we were talking about before. But it's very suspicious with UN and all these people who are against Israel. That to me there's anti-Semitism.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. It's a really interesting thing. Also, if you read in the news today, I hope you guys remember I've been telling you to subscribe to the Daily Alert and to subscribe to the Jewish Daily Briefing. So I think it's in the Daily Alert. It's in the Jewish news, right? Because it was recent. The president of Turkey, Erdogan, right? He said that he's going to visit Israel, not with a specific date, but he said he's going to visit Israel. And if anybody knows recent history, specifically in 2010, there was a chilling amount of tension, let alone last year. I'll come back to that in a second. But in 2010, there was a very chilling separation between Turkey and Israel, which enjoys strategic economic partnerships. And Israel gets a lot of water from Turkey. And now Turkey is enjoying all of the gas that Israel discovered. And it's, in its major natural gas fields just off the coast. All of that stuff is happening while the relationship chilled because there was a Turkish-based convoy that broke the blockade, and which the Israeli military shot people who were activists bringing illegal weaponry to the people of Hamas to fight against Israel. And that Turkey was saying shame on you, or even as of what I said, this last war, that they were like, they're killing children, and like he made a statement, they're killing these poor innocent children and they're sucking their blood. This is what he said, right? This is the president of Turkey, right? And he said this, and by the way, he was castigated by the world stage for saying these things, but he also just said that he's going to visit Israel. So what's going on? What's going on? There's a division about, there's a part about us and the rest of the world, and the acceptance of us and the rest of the world. And also, like, what is, to me, it was a stunning question. What really is the non-violent response to taking away a country's right to exist? So far, there hasn't yet been something like that in existence in the world. And even if you have like these, horrible beliefs, Turkey said, shame on you, Israel, for doing all these horrible things. Well, apparently, in a little bit of time, things get a little bit better. And that's only 12 years. Did I make that point clear? Do you sort of like get what's going on here? So there's that. That's a piece of this, is that the attention on Israel, I would also add, it's a fascination. It is academic. I think that it excites us. It excites our mind because it's so darn complicated. It's not so clear cut. And I think that that's why there's so much attention on it. And the clarity about it, it seems like, if you talk to Israelis in cafes, they'll tell you how clear it is. People solve the problem very easily, right? And then like sip their coffee and eat their cookie, right? But it's a very complicated thing, okay? And the fact that it's complicated is why there's so much attention on it. And then I would think another piece of this is that it is, there's two ways that I would say this. This is just my thought. One is, it's like if you have something that you are focused on, a precious gem, and you devote your attention upon it, and you radiate that attention upon that, it garners the interest of others. It's as if having that thing is something that is covetous, and so there is a sense of coveting of the Holy Land, right? That this is considered to be the birthplace of the three major religions in the world. And there's a coveting of who owns that land. And that seems to be also a subject of great focus and attention. Who gets that right? Okay? Right now, Israel has it. That pisses a lot of people off. I just said that. Okay? All right. Last piece. This is the third argument. Go ahead, Lauren, please.
One sec.
There is finally a third argument for why anti-Semitism equals anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism. It is that a practical matter for two animosities simply go together. Of course, it's theoretically possible to distinguish anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism, just as it's theoretically possible to distinguish segregationism from racism, writes Stevens. Just as virtually all segregationists are also racist, he suggests. Virtually all anti-Zionists are also anti-Semites. You really find one without the other. But that claim is empirically false. In the real world, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism don't go together. It is easy to find anti-Semitism among people who, far from opposing Zionism, enthusiastically embrace it.
Okay. So do you get his last point, right? I mean, remember, these are just little like, telegraphed quotes out of the whole article. I gave you, if you look online, but I didn't give it into the printout, but if you look at this document online, or I could send it to you again, the actual article of the Peter Beinart that he wrote in The Guardian, it's great. It's a great article. You got to read this stuff, right? And the one that has Jonathan Greenblatt and in the New Yorker is also great. Because they show you that not only are these complex issues, but the sort of intellectualism of these issues is at a very high level. These are not just people who are expressing points of view. This is not just, we have in our Torah and our Talmud, which I think is smart, but we have in our ancient tradition these things that say this is the way that it's supposed to be, right? While that's good for us as Jews, that's not necessarily relevant for the rest of the world. But if you hear these sort of like real world, topical of the moment arguments for why Israel should exist, should not exist, it really also makes this conversation that more enriching. This last comment is, look, if you are to say that that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are like two peas in a pod, if you will, right? Then to say that if you're proto-segregation, then you're a racist, okay? Now, if you talk to somebody, this is interesting, right? In the 1950s, and you said to them, are you pro-segregation? Yes, right? But they would also say, you know what? I'm also pro-gender division in schools, okay? Does that make you a racist and a misogynist? Well, yeah, you know what? Kind of like after we learned a little bit, after a while, kind of, right? I mean, that's the point here. Where Beinart, I think, misses, this is my critique, is that there's a kind of here that you can't just wash out and say anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. However, what he does bring, which is right, is that not all anti-Semites are anti-Zionists. And I think in his argument, he's thinking about the Christian evangelist who thinks that all the Jews should go back to Israel, right? Because that's where, and talk about being an ultimate form of anti-Semitism. Bring all the Jews back to Israel so they can all die for the second coming of the Messiah. Is that not the ultimate form of anti-Semitism? It could be. And the question is, does that argument exist? It could exist. Is it a dominant mindset in the majority of the world? Absolutely not. And it is important to remember that. There are arguments that represent minorities of all of this. But anytime that we take a minority view and we conflate it to a majority view without showing the sort of like distinction between the two, we are susceptible to bias, right? That's what bias means. That's when we forget to see the whole because of the small. And that kind of thinking is very dangerous. So a couple comments, and then we'll call it Jay and Judy.
Okay. Yeah, I was having a hard time because it says it's easy to find anti-Semitism among people who are far from opposing Zionism. You gave the example of like the fundamental Christians, but still that to me is anti-Semitism because they eventually want us to, rotten. We're not going to go to heaven because we're not baptized, and we're going to, So I'm having a hard time finding examples of anti-Semitism for people who oppose Zionism.
Right. I think my sense is that his comment was an oblique reference to Christian evangelicals and any other sort of evangelical, like Mormonism has a little bit of this as well. That any sort of religious identity says that Jews can exist. Okay, because by the way, there wasn't a state of Israel when the Holocaust came to be. Right? And as much as the Neturei Karta says that it's the fault of us wanting to have a state that brought upon the Holocaust, that's just simply not true. So were they anti-Zionists? No, they were like flat out anti-Semites, right? So anti-Semitism probably includes anti-Zionism. But what I think he's trying to distinguish is that anti-Zionism doesn't always have to include anti-Semitism. And I would say the other part of this oblique reference is for him. He is an intellectual who is trying to argue for that. But I would imagine that if anybody took Peter Beinart seriously, which by the way, he did take it seriously, but they brought him into the room and said, okay, one state, two state solution, Jewish democratic authority, Jewish state or a state of Israel that isn't, has no unique Jewish character, whatever, that he would probably find a lot more satisfaction and a lot more Jewish influence than not. He's Jewish. He's not anti-Jewish. He's Jewish. And I said that passionately, right? Judy.
So am I correct in assuming that anti-Semitism usually applies to Jews, even though all Arabs are Semites also? Why did that
Great.
come about?
Well, wasn't that a great thing in that show, Mo? Which, by the way, you guys all have to watch. It's really cute. I finished it, right? Like, you
Okay.
can't call me an anti-Semite. I'm a Semite, right? So it's right. So yes, I think if you go to like legal definitions of what is anti-Semitism, it refers specifically to Judaism. And would you say that another Semitic group that hates Jews, are they anti-Semitic? No, they're anti-Jewish, right? And by the way, if you talk to Palestinians, modern progressive Palestinians who want a middle class state, they refer to Israelis as Yahud, right? They don't say Israeli, they say Yahud. Yahud means Jew, okay? But there they refer to it as a national identity, Yahud, like Judaism, right? It's an interesting kind of like play on language. It's a question of linguistics here, okay? It's a good question. Can you be an anti-Semite and only hate Jews? Yes. Yeah, because that's pretty much what the definition of it is.
Seems like now that's all it means.
Yeah, that's pretty much, I mean, in common parlance, that's all it means, right? So, and by the way, guys, like you remember when there was the like proposal for the Muslim registry in this country after 9/11? You remember that?
Yeah.
Right? You know who was like on the front line fighting against that? Jewish communities. The Jewish community was right there fighting against it. You know why? Because there's something in the Jewish identity here. This is the sort of Zionist identity, Jewish and Zionist identity that says that we believe that there needs to be places in the world that protect the identity and the cultural uniqueness of every people on the planet. And the fact that there is a perception that Palestinians are marginalized and they are denied their right to exist as Palestinians is patently false. That's as I think we've discussed. There are things that prevent the autonomy of the Palestinian people to function equally in the state of Israel. That is also very true. But those two things are different, and we'll talk about that in upcoming classes. All right, any other comments for what we have been learning today? All right, so the question is, can you be an anti-Zionist and not an anti-Semite? Or is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? Anybody want to take a stab at it, or should I just leave you to sort of think? I'm going to leave you.
Do you think everybody understands? You know, there's some people probably not understand what anti-Zionism means. So yes, you could be an anti-Semite and not be an anti-Zionist because they might not even know.
Right. That's the sort of the binary argument is what he's saying. Right. That's a sort of like, you know, you can hate Jews just because you hate Jews and you have no idea that there's a place called Israel.
Right.
Right.
Right. Mm-hmm. Or you have no idea what that place means. So there is that.
Or where it is, or what it is.
Yeah, there is that in the world, but that's again, we're talking about a very small minority amongst the majority of people that we're talking about here. Sherry.
Mute,
Sherry.
Why do so many people immigrate here and so many people go there? Make Aliyah there to Israel.
I'm trying to answer your question. I think you know the answer to the question.
Money.
Well, but the ones, my friends that have gone there, well, why do they go there? Put it that way. Are they?
I'm asking. Yeah, try to give it an answer. I mean, I have answers, but I'm curious. What do you think?
Well, my one that I can speak of is a wacko.
Right. So there's no. I mean, maybe if you change your language, that people go all places in the world for ideologies. There are ideological reasons. Or you have Lauren throw it out there that it's an economic thing, right? Why do so many Israelis come here? Economic. Why do so many Americans go there? Because it's ideological. Okay. Nobody's necessarily going to Israel because they're going to make a fortune. Although that is the case. Jay, what do you want to say? You were eager to jump in.
They come.
Yes, when Lori and I were in Israel, our tour guide told us a joke, and it applies to what we're talking about. The joke is that this guy from the Soviet Union moves to Israel, and his Israeli neighbor says, "So how's life in the Soviet Union?" He goes, "Well, can't complain." He says, "Well, what about the religious issues?" "I can't complain." "Well, what about economics?" "I can't complain." He says, "Well, why did you move to Israel?" He says, "Here I could complain."
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly it. It's beautiful, right? We have a place in the world that is just for us. And you know what? It's annoying and enervating, and it draws the ire of the nations of the world. And you know what? There's something to it. And you know that you're talking to people that you want to have a conversation with when they hear a joke like that and they laugh.
Yeah.
Right? Because the next thing might be, this place is horrible, or this place is amazing. But the fact that this is a place where that can happen is great. I was talking to my wife today and thought the same idea. We need a new Talmud. The 21st century needs a new Talmud. We need a new set of books that has sacred arguments about what is the meaning of life and what are the right things for the Jewish people to do in this world. And just like the Talmud, which doesn't have very clear, conclusive knowledge about what is the right thing to do, it's an unfolding of conversation. We need the same thing, right? We all need to be sitting around some
write it. You have time. Write that. Make that your next book.
That's great. Believe me, there are a lot of people that have written that book already too. Candy or Norman?
Yeah, in ancient times, the people left not only because they were driven out by the Romans, but because there was no way to survive in Israel, because whatever the power structure was didn't permit for the people at the bottom of the heap. So they went elsewhere where they could survive. The same thing happening today in Israel, and to me, that's dead wrong. If you want to have a country that says welcome to all Jews, then welcome them all Jews permanently. Don't say come in there and then there's no place to work, or the salaries for the people on the bottom are minimal, and so minimal that they can't afford to live there. You're creating the same situation today that what existed 2,000 years ago. And I think that's morally bankrupt.
It's a very passionate response and a good response. And I would just add that not only has there been emigration away from the land of Israel throughout time, I mean, we have it even in the Bible that the two tribes don't enter into the land, even though they're supposed to give it. Moses says, "What do you mean? God's promising you this land and they want to stay on the other side." Why? Because it's better there for them. So from the outset, we already have this concept that the land is not necessarily supposed to be exclusively for the sort of well-being or the spiritual fulfillment of the identity of this unique people. And I will just add as well that throughout history, on the other side, there has always maintained a Jewish presence. There's always been a Jewish presence in the land of Israel since Abraham first discovered God 3,400 years ago. And that's also an important piece of this, is that it's not like, I suppose that we could project in the future that there always will be Jews in that land. That's what I would like to say. Yes, you have something more? Go ahead and unmute. Yeah.
I was just thinking, but coming back to one of Jay's comments before about power, we were power, and now we have power again. And Rabbi, the idea of what do we do with that power? Are we going to take that to question what we've done in the past, like you're saying, create a new Talmud? What are we going to do to better ourselves as Jewish people, as our identity, because now we do have that say and we do have that power. And that's the question for me, the question of all of this.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I don't want to answer it yet, okay? Because I not because I'm evading, not in the least. I'll say this one piece, and then I'll think that there's more to talk about. I really think that part of the answer is evolving in the conversations that we're yet to have in this class. But I will say this: in 2005, Yitz Greenberg, Irving Greenberg, who was a professor, wonderful rabbi and professor. He was a great friend of Rabbi Schulweis's, for those who knew. And he wrote something about it was called The Ethics of Jewish Power. And he basically said that to take on the tools of power is to take on the tools of responsibility. And very quickly, I will respond to say that the answer, Candy, to your question is that now that Jews have power is how do they wield it responsibly? And that is a very difficult thing because every other national power that has existed on the planet since time immemorial has grappled with its ethical responsibility ever since, right? And you know what? Some do it better than others. Some do it better than others. Okay, yeah, Alice. Oh, okay, great. Sherry dropped off, and anybody else?
Next week, no class, right?
Right.
No
So
class
now,
until the 25th of October, right?
right, we are now off in our classes, and the next one is on October 25th. So,
Oh, but
Shana Tova, everyone.
so
Yeah,
Shana Tova.
everybody.